Okay, more and more people are entering the room, but I think it's time to start. So good afternoon, everyone, to today's ECIPE online webinar. My name is Matthias Bauer. I'm the director here at ECIPE, and today we want to talk about Europe's Digital Markets Act and how its enforcement can impact cybersecurity in the EU. I would also like to say good morning and good evening to those of you who are joining from overseas. At ECIPE, we are committed to evidence-based analysis of the policies shaping Europe's economy, Europe's digital economy. We do a lot of work on trade and technology policymaking, and in one of our recent policy briefs, we raised the fundamental question: could the EU's Digital Markets Act, which is novel regulation in the EU, largely untested regulation in the EU, could it actually weaken cybersecurity, and could it actually weaken user protections? Today, we want to take this question further and explore whether the way Article 5.4 in particular is enforced or will be enforced in the future may in fact be at odds with the EU's own cybersecurity priorities, including the Network and Infrastructure Security Directive or the EU Cybersecurity Act, let alone member states' strategies to improve cybersecurity across all parts of the economy, private and public sector institutions. To help us unpack what I would consider an important issue, we are joined by three distinguished speakers. We have with us today Mikolaj Bartjentjevic. He is an associate professor of law at the University of Surrey. Mikolaj is also a senior scholar at the International Center for Law and Economics. And Mikolaj's work offers what I would consider a sharp lens on digital regulation, and his recent piece, Google and Apple Determinations, show how little users actually matter under the DMA. It has stirred quite some debate. We also have with us today Joe Corneliu. Joe is the director of the Schumpeter project on competition policy at ITIF in Washington, D.C. Joe, as ITIF, is a leading voice on innovation policy and competition policy, and today he brings a transatlantic perspective on how competition enforcement actually intersects cybersecurity. And last but not least, we have with us today Kay Jebeli. Kay is the senior director for Europe at the Chamber of Brokers, and he is the author of a very, I would say, an interesting paper with a very provocative title. It's about Europe's digital curtain, how the EU DMA is turning Europeans into second-class digital citizens. We have also invited two additional female speakers, expert speakers, to this panel, but unfortunately both Natasha Gerler from CIPL and Ayesha Bhatti from ITIF were not available today. We have also tried to get to the panel app developers who, however, are somewhat hesitant to speak out publicly, but we have a few developers in our audience. So please, dear audience, feel free to raise some questions or comments or observations in the last quarter of the hour, in which we allow our audience to raise questions and comments. Now, without further ado, each of our speaker will now have 5 to 8 minutes for an introductory intervention. And I would like to start with you, Mikolaj. So, Mikolaj, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I've been thinking about cybersecurity implications of the Digital Markets Act, or even since before it was called the Digital Markets Act, because when I first heard about some of the obligations that were being considered for this planned regulation, immediately thought about the question of how will this be done safely, especially for those who are the users of the services which are being regulated by what is now the DMA. And to start from a relatively broad perspective, the DMA has in several ways acknowledges this problem. For example, in Article 8, it says that whenever they are discharging their obligations, the gatekeepers are supposed to make sure that the way they do it complies with other regulations than the DMA, and that provision name checks the GDPR and also refers to cybersecurity regulations. And even within some, not all, provisions of Article 5 and Article 6 on specific obligations of the gatekeepers, some of those obligations come with explicit provisions for safeguards, especially for privacy. What I've been criticizing for a long time is that I didn't quite see why only some of the provisions come with those explicit safeguards, not all of them. What is that supposed to mean? Does it mean that only those provisions that do have explicit safeguards allow gatekeepers to protect user privacy and so on? So I guess the Commission's answer is that, well, Article 8.1 applies to everything, so perhaps we should read the DMA as including that gatekeeper obligation. And this brings me to one thing that I think the Commission, in my view, sees at least presumptively any user privacy and security concerns that gatekeepers may raise as unjustified. So whatever Apple, Google, Meta, and so on say that well, there are some things that we shouldn't be doing, or some specific ways in which we can discharge our obligations and not other ways because of security concerns, the Commission starts from a position of disbelief, of a presumptive rejection of that argument. And I think the Commission also interpreted the DMA's approach, because the DMA in Article 8.1 says that, well, it's the duty of the gatekeeper to comply with the GDPR and other obligations. So I think the Commission read it as meaning that they can wash their hands of this aspect altogether. It's not their job to care to take this into account at all. And I guess they believe that the gatekeepers, out of their own self-interest, will be able to sort of argue so strongly for user security interests that the Commission will never reach a situation that they are forcing something that would be unsafe. I don't think that's a realistic and appropriate way for a public authority to work, but it seems to me that the Commission did adopt this view. And I also think, without going into too much detail, and we will do that later, that the Commission's general approach is that they dismiss any security concerns which are not strictly technical cybersecurity concerns. So the Commission does not take on board something which I think in the cybersecurity literature and practice is just an obvious fact, which is that technical measures are often not nearly as important as behavioral aspects of security, and also as the key aspect of who is trustworthy and who isn't. And for example, personally, I'm I trust Apple with my data, and I trust Google with my data much more than I would trust with many app developers, which I also use. And I'm happy that to some extent I can limit what third-party developers can do with my data, because I think rationally I trust those two companies more. And it does seem to me that the Commission entirely rejects this pretty basic fact without any real argument, but they just don't accept it. And yes, and they also don't really take into account the question of behavioral aspects of cybersecurity. Just thinking as if the DMA only allowed protecting cybersecurity in purely technical ways. So this is my general overview, and I'm sure that we'll talk about many details of those DMA obligations and how they interact with cybersecurity later on.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nikolai. Yeah, it's in a way puzzling. We see the NIS2, we see the Cyber Resilience Act, where the focus is on critical infrastructure, where the focus is on networks, where the focus is on businesses like manufacturing companies to make the necessary precautions for cybersecurity. But when it comes to individual users, and most of us are wearing handsets that are run by, on iOS or Android, we are talking about hundreds of millions of handsets in Europe. And it seems to be the case that the European Commission is trying to prioritize principle-based, potentially also ideology-based enforcement over technical aspects, and I would say hard and obvious facts, actually, if you follow the debate in the cybersecurity community, which can hardly be overseen by, let's say, less tech-savvy or less cybersecurity-savvy individuals too. Now over to you, Joe. When you look at it from an outsider's perspective, the United States, which doesn't have a Digital Markets Act, what are the preliminary conclusions you arrive at?
Sure. Thanks, Matthias, and appreciate everybody, ECIPE, for having me. So first, at a high level, I know we'll get into the details later in the panel, but I think one of the first things to realize, when we're talking about these anti-steering rules as well as ex-ante competition regulation more generally, is that I don't think there should be necessarily any fundamental contradiction between competition policy goals and security goals. And I think this is in part one of the reasons why the DMA is actually so very concerning. So, if you believe that antitrust and security really are separate spheres, when you are talking about ex-ante regulation, as opposed to sort of regular ex-post law enforcement, in the ex-ante context, this is usually where you've got a lot more room to take a broader approach and kind of ask what's in the public interest so that you can ensure that, let's say, your competition goals are not coming at the expense of the security goals. But of course, this is not the approach the DMA takes. It really is a very narrowly tailored competition regulation. And I do think that idea of compartmentalization does create this broad risk of trade-offs with other policy goals like cybersecurity at a structural high level. And then the second point, I think Mikolaj was getting into this already, but I'll just sort of second what he was saying. Even if you'd want to do one of these narrow competition regulations, there still shouldn't be any necessary trade-off between protecting competition and security, at least in a lot of these digital markets where, security is very often a key dimensionality of how firms are competing, right? So again, as the American Europhile on the panel, albeit not a DMA file, to be clear, I can just say that this debate was basically had in the United States in the context of the EPIC litigation that's been ongoing for some time. One of the things EPIC argued was that Apple's security and privacy rationales were basically social. They didn't constitute legitimate pro-competitive justifications that should be considered. And the U.S. courts, rightly and rejected this view. Consumers obviously want security and privacy in their tech, and that's something that firms are going to compete on, in areas like mobile. And that should be a part of competition, including when you're doing it under the DMA. And then I guess the last thing I would just say in general is, it's not just that the DMA is ex-ante regulation, but because it has these per se rules that it uses against anti-steering and other types of behavior. And what this does, of course, is it excludes the ability for firms to make any kind of pro-competitive justifications on security or other lines. And that's where you get, I think, a real conflict. And again, I think, sort of looking around the world here, just because we're doing ex-ante regulation doesn't necessarily mean at all that we have to have these sorts of per se rules. I would note, for example, United Kingdom's DMCCA, they do allow companies to present pro-competitive justifications. And, in fact, to go back to the Epic case, this isn't just hypothetical, but the court specifically found there that Apple's in-app distribution and in-app payment requirements did have legitimate, cognizable security justifications, right? Now, with the anti-steering, it's true that they were found to be illegal in that case, but I would note that was really under California law, which is not quite per se, but it doesn't really allow for pro-competitive justifications. The court certainly didn't find that the anti-steering rules don't have those sorts of pro-competitive justifications under the Sherman Act. And I think they probably clearly do. So I think I'll just maybe stop there. But again, high level, I think there certainly doesn't need to be any trade-off between competition and security. But unfortunately, the way the DMA is structured with these sort of per se rules that limit conduct, we know at least the United States in many cases can be pro-competitive. That's certainly a problem.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. Also referring to, let's say, a key difference in US and EU competition enforcement. The US is often said, and I think it's true, to be much more user-centric, relying much more on case-by-case competition enforcement, which also requires a lot of work on the side of authorities to make their case. And this is obviously not true anymore in the EU. If you come across or if you look into DMA enforcement files, we are not yet sure how this issue is going to unfold. Maybe there will be a decision, an enforcement guidance provided by the European Commission, which may be challenged, and courts may decide in the end whether it's challenged on substantial grounds or not. That remains to be seen. But now over to UK. You have also worked extensively on DMA enforcement, not only focusing on cybersecurity issues, but also on other issues such as customer choice and how innovation is being rolled out in Europe. Could you elaborate a bit more about that?
Yeah, certainly. So as part of my role with the Chamber of Progress, which is a tech industry association with a lot of industry supporters from around the world, I'm based in Brussels myself, though, even though I don't sound like it. So I've been here for 15 years and I used to be a competition lawyer beforehand. But as an association, we back policies that will build a fairer and more inclusive world in which all people benefit from technological leaps. And what we've seen with the Digital Markets Act is that it's holding this back a bit. So as you mentioned, we did a report that analyzed the consumer impact of the DMA so far. It was published in December of last year, at the end of the year. And we found that from the consumer perspective, the DMA had degraded apps and services. It had delayed or even foreclosed innovations from being launched in Europe, and that it made services less safe and less private. So the DMA, which is sort of meant to be promoting competition on the platforms, is doing so by opening them up in various ways, by allowing third parties to contact customers directly, to transact with them directly, to circumvent the platform's protections, in order to give them a little bit of a freer hand when taking advantage of the platform operators or the ecosystem services, taking advantage of the user base, the network effects that are available on that platform, and to be less restrained by the protections of that platform operator. And so this kind of promotion of competition has inadvertently, what we've seen, made things less secure. And there's actually a startling example of this that we wrote about in our report that comes from just regular antitrust. And it shows this tension between increasing competition and privacy risks. This was back in actually just last year, July of 24. There was a global IT outage that was caused by a faulty update from cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike, which disrupted millions of individuals and businesses worldwide. There were memes about it being posted online of all kinds of things, supermarket displays, even things that you wouldn't expect to have been affected by this. And part of the reason why this happened, which Microsoft pointed to, was attributed to European intervention. Because back in 2009, the European Commission had agreed to commitments from Microsoft that granted third-party security services the same access to Windows as Microsoft's own security services. So this kind of, okay, well, it's good for competition because we're allowing third-party security providers to the same hardware and software that Windows has, so they can offer substitutes for Microsoft. But this compliance meant creating a systemic vulnerability, which was triggered by this faulty update, and which caused this kind of global IT outage. And it sort of underscores how government antitrust intervention and regulations, while intended to promote competition and security, can create new vulnerabilities with many unintended consequences, especially when that antitrust enforcement is really based on siloed thinking and puts aside the cybersecurity concerns, or says, well, that's someone else's problem, not my problem. When we should be realizing that actually it's everyone's problem. What we're seeing already today is, as a result of some of the DMA interventions and the compliance with the DMA, we've got third-party app stores, but these app stores are filled with pirated products, pirated software, piracy-enabling stuff. Pornography is one of the famous examples on the Apple App Store. And other things that app store ecosystems or these gatekeepers would try to gatekeep from. So that's, I think fundamentally exposes one of the core issues that we have seen arise from the way the DMA is being enforced by the Commission. It seems that the Commission sees gatekeepers merely as middlemen who are imposing a tax, and actually everything would be better if we get rid of these middlemen. But in reality, the gatekeepers are cultivating an ecosystem and protecting people. I mean, it's in the name itself. They're gatekeepers. They're protecting the gates. They're building gates that enable this garden, this digital garden, to bloom. And by removing those gates, what we are seeing is that actually that ecosystem is being harmed. That there is this beneficial gatekeeping that is being lost amidst this enforcement. And that's kind of where we're really concerned, because it's going to lead to a worse user experience for people in Europe. Yeah, very happy to be here, and thanks for this opportunity to discuss it further.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kay. I think you've highlighted that users are in many respects ignored, or let's say not prioritized when it comes to DMA enforcement. And I think that's already been true when the DMA was designed in the first place, where the debate was a lot about contestability and fairness, which both are broad terms. And even within the competition policy and competition theory community, discussed very controversially. Now, allow me one more follow-up question. I mean, given that you are very critical as concerns how the DMA is designed, how it is enforced. I mean, given that we are having it and it's unlikely to go away, at least not in the near-term future, where do you consider or where would you like to see improvements, especially when it comes to how the DMA will be enforced in the future?
Well, I think that there is kind of a tacit admission by the Commission that they do have the discretion to enforce this in a way that is less harmful to users. And you can see that quite plainly in actually some of the decisions that were published, I think only last week. There's the specification decision and the non-compliance decisions against Apple and Meta. And these have shown that the commission is willing to consider, even though, formally it doesn't say it's obliged to, it did analyze security concerns, and found that, okay, well, it found in the end that in those cases, the security concerns or the steps taken to protect the security objectives were not proportionate and necessary to achieve the intended results. But even though those obligations that were concerned didn't have security and privacy objectives or defenses built within them, the commission still did look at it. So either that's a admission from the commission that those things are important and that it has the discretion and an obligation indeed when it comes to proportionality to make sure it does check those arguments, or that they've had advice from their legal service that the court would probably consider that to be the case. So, of course, we do have to wait to see what the courts will ultimately do. But I think that there is space for the commission to consider these arguments closely, at least in these decisions. They have to some extent, whether they've given due credit to the arguments of the defendants, that will have to be determined in court. But I hope that we continue to see the commission take efforts to do what it can to minimize the harms that users experience.
Thank you very much. Now over to you again, Nikolai. In your recent paper about Google and Apple determinations and how little, as you say, users actually matter under the DMA, you write, and I'm quoting here, what the commission appears to want Google to do is to allow app developers to include not only full apps in the Play Store, but also links to other websites where users could download apps, not from the Play Store, but from these websites. And you say that you would be surprised if commission officials realize it, but this is precisely what malicious app development or app developers want and have long been seeking to achieve through other means. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that in particular?
Sure. So there is a one pretty strong difference between well, at least the way iOS, Apple's ecosystem for iPhones used to work, and Google's Android. The feature of Google's Android has been that users in principle can install any apps they want. They can download apps as packages from any website, not just from the Google Play Store. And of course, it will not surprise anyone that if that's a possibility, users can also install apps that they may later learn that they really didn't want to install, but they were probably tricked into installing. So Google tries to prevent that to the extent they can within the Play Store. Whenever a developer submits an app, there is at least some automatic code scanning that happens for the packages which are in the Play Store that then users can download. So there is at least a layer of prevention here. And what happened, there was in my article, I even quote a recent sort of hacking campaign where what the hackers managed, or the malicious actors managed to do, was that they were able to get a seemingly perfectly fine normal app accepted in the Play Store. That app did not contain a malicious code as such, except for a link to an external link beyond that app to another kind of an app, a package that inviting users. Basically, the app presented it as it's just functionality within the app that you already know. You click this button, you just add a bit more functionality, and what the user added really was kind of Trojan that was stealing their data, right? So this happened because the only thing that the malicious actor needed was this link out. And in that case, the link out was within the app. So what is being proposed here is that those links out will not even need to be hidden within apps, but they will be in the Play Store itself. And at least one pretty serious difference will be that if users click on that, those packages that they find on the other side of those links will not. It will be impossible for Google and to screen them for the code for security reasons. So what I see as particularly problematic here is not the fact that Android has this openness, you can install any app you want. What I see as problematic is the behavioral aspect of it, that users so far were habituated, accustomed to trusting and at least knowing that there is some layer of security of checking the code of the apps they can click and download from the Play Store, and suddenly the links will still be on the Play Store, but those links will not have that quality anymore, right? They will not have that protection, and of course, and you can imagine that if Google starts adding what some people call scare screens to it, then the Commission will oppose it, because the Commission stands on the ground that says that no, Google or Apple or other gatekeepers are not allowed to tell their users that their products are safe, even though that's true. So that's that is part of the problem here. But so what I would insist on for the Commission as well is to take very seriously the changes to habits of users and how such a seemingly simple thing can give unearned trust to third parties who they shouldn't be stopped from offering apps, but they should need to earn the trust themselves, right? It shouldn't be just a sleight of hand, oh, we're just changing links and now suddenly it's up to the user to just fend for themselves.
Yeah, I agree. Before we hand over to Joe again, I would like to encourage our audience to put questions and comments in our chat so I can refer to them in a minute. Joe, to you again. Nikolai, he highlighted the key differences between Apple's proprietary app ecosystem, mobile operating system, and Android's open source heavy ecosystem. There are obviously differences. In the US, you would probably have case-by-case assessments. In the EU, you would expect, or I would expect, the DMA to be enforced in a technology-neutral way. The question is this actually possible? And should DMA enforcement actually be adopted to reflect the fundamental technical but also commercial differences between Android and iOS security models?
Thanks for the question, Matthias. So we published a report at ITIF basically analyzing a bunch of different digital regulation regimes around the world. And one of the things we noted is that there is a difference between, let's say, models like the European Union's DMA, which, as you say, has these sort of neutral rules that apply to everyone, versus, let's say, a regime like the UK's DMCC, which I mentioned before, where you have this idea that company-specific codes will be developed, right, on a company-specific basis. And, you know, as we argued in the report, there are pros and cons with each approach, right? So if you have general rules like the DMA, you know, you're going to have more error costs, right? Let's say in the sense of false positives by ignoring differences in different markets or different products. However, on the UK approach, let's say, you know, you might have a reduction in error costs because you're able to take a more tailored approach. But, you know, you also have this concern that comes about in the sense of capture, right, which is another big concern where regulation takes advantage of that to really harm certain platforms much more so than others. And I think when you look at the broader Brussels effect that's going on and all the regulation that's happening around the world being considered, that's certainly something that's certainly a very serious concern. Now, when it comes to iOS and Android, I want to go back to the Epic v. Apple case in the United States because we actually had some very concrete findings on exactly this sort of issue. So, with respect to the app distribution requirements, the court specifically found as a pro-competitive justification that it promoted interbrand competition, right, as a corollary, so to speak, of the security justification. What they said was that the centralized app distribution, basically the walled garden approach, is a differentiating factor between Apple and Google, and that can, increase consumer choice, right, by allowing platforms to compete along those lines. Now, of course, I think it's true. Google would certainly say they also offer a secure platform in their own way. But again, I think the real key point here is that security, again, is a key dimensionality of competition in smartphones. And you need to have law and regulatory regimes that don't ignore that factor. And then lastly, since we're talking about differentiating platforms on security grounds, and this is something we talk a lot about at ITIF, I think we should at least flag a potential second order effect here of sort of US platforms that are, in my view, targeted by the DMA. They're going to be less attractive to EU consumers from a security perspective, precisely because they're not allowed to engage in a lot of this behavior, which I think in many cases can increase security for users behaviorally. And where will the EU consumers that value security very highly go, right? I hope that they go to great European firms that come up and potentially offer alternatives. But I think the reality is that Europe is very behind in digital in tech, that it's much more likely that they may go to Chinese rivals, right, who now have an ability to compete by doing certain things to improve security, precisely because they're not deemed gatekeepers in the DMA that American firms can't do. So you risk what, to my view, would be certainly sort of a ridiculous outcome where, Chinese or other, let's say, non-Western firms are going to win share of European consumers who may be particularly security focused in their purchasing decisions, and go to these platforms, which actually, for a variety of reasons, may not ultimately create more security at all, right? Moving European consumers to more Chinese platforms. So I think that's certainly a possible second order consequence that we should be mindful of here.
Thank you very much. Now a question to all of you on the panel. I mean, the debate is essentially about consumers, customer choice, but also about users' desire to enjoy privacy and to have security, app security. Now, I wonder where consumer organizations actually stand regarding these issues. From the past, we know, and I can speak for Europe, we've seen many consumer protection organizations to share a negative view as concerns large technology companies, especially those coming from non-EU jurisdictions like the United States. And I wonder whether consumer protection organizations are realizing that there is an issue here with DMA enforcement and security and secure app ecosystems, secure mobile operating systems, or where they stand, and whether there is a difference between what we are seeing in the EU and some member states, or Brussels with the, BOIC, the umbrella organization, and the United States. Kate, do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a kind of a wicked reverse catch-22 situation, because on the one hand, the DMA could potentially create these benefits for European offerings. So this kind of suspicion against US tech companies is obviated by users having the choice to switch over to European alternatives. So on the one, so that works, and then on the other hand, well, even if these things are being degraded, and there's going to be less security for consumers, that's only happening to the US companies. So the users still have the ability to get a curated, tailored experience from European or as Joseph correctly pointed out, I think mostly it's going to be Chinese alternatives. So it's only the US companies that aren't able to have these more curated, more security focused experiences for their users, while everyone else can still do it. So and what we showed in our report as well then. So the US services are in a way being degraded, both from a functionality perspective and also from a privacy perspective, which we've talked about as being an important element of competition. So that degradation itself will encourage more people then to migrate to other services. So you get it both ways. And ultimately, I think that is part of one of the reasons why the U.S. administration has come out and criticized regulation like the EU regulation like the DMA.
Yeah. Anyone else wants to jump in? Nikolai, maybe a perspective from the UK?
So I can speak about the UK a bit less, but what I do observe is how privacy activist organizations, which are not necessarily consumer organizations, but how they have been approaching this, and I noted that there is very little willingness to take any position which could be perceived as standing on the side of the gatekeepers. But almost to the extreme that looks like an abandonment of their sort of long-held positions, which I find very strange, or just making just very implausible arguments. So, for example, there is it's not very recent. It predates the DMA, but thinking about the DMA, I think as a proposal, Cory Doctorow co-wrote an article on interoperability and its security implications, and basically he said that there is no risk to, even though he previously wrote a very good article about the risks of legally mandated interoperability. And then he wrote a second one where he says, well, because Europe has GDPR, there is no risk or there is no problem. So the mere existence of the GDPR, entirely just abstracting away from any issues of enforcement and so on, somehow solves the problem and makes the imposing a per se mandate safe. I mean, that's not a serious argument, and any sort of privacy activist would also agree that there are serious problems with GDPR enforcement. So yes, so I do see the situation as very curious.
Okay, and Joe, do you want to come in here as well?
Just very briefly. So I do think it's potentially possible that in the future you could see some consumer action, criticizing the DMA, consumer groups, whatever it may be. Kay mentioned the CrowdStrike example. I mean, I think that certainly is a big one, but I think largely focused on enterprises. But well, certainly with some consumer effects. But another sort of effect that you could get from this sort of DMA provision that I think really does going to be very clear to consumers and something they directly can experience and understand is this idea that, let's say, because of the DMA's restrictions, you could see features get delayed, right? Or not even released at all. And I think one example of this, in Europe, that is, and one of the examples of this would be Apple Intelligence, right? In which these new AI features that Apple put out, my understanding, give a more personalized, sort of deeper integrated experience for consumers. And of course, this was an example of something that went live in the US, right? And didn't go live in Europe until much later, largely because Apple did have these sorts of cybersecurity concerns, right? Precisely because you were giving this more personalized experience. There was a greater risk, through things like interoperability, for example. So I do think those sorts of things, like why is it that I can have something in the United States and then when I go to Europe I can't? I think those sorts of concerns ultimately will become very manifest to consumers over time and ultimately bubble up maybe into some sort of advocacy effort, right? Even a delayed innovation is still a welfare loss. And again, maybe next time it's not just a delay, but a feature that doesn't come out at all, right? Or for years. So that's certainly a consumer-facing risk that we've already seen, and I think is likely to manifest itself again in other contexts as a result of the DMA.
Okay, yeah. So I hear there are some privacy centric organizations that have it on the radar, but not so much traditional consumer organizations. I have two more questions, but still would like to encourage our audience to put some questions in the chat box. We also wanted to discuss impacts on app developers. I'm not sure if you can address these questions, given that you are not representing an app development organization, app development company, but maybe you can address this question anyway. So what risks do app developers face from mandatory external linking? What are the incentives that they now face as concerns taking a certain degree of responsibility for safeguarding users? Any thoughts here?
I'm happy to just make one comment that so I think the knee-jerk reaction from app developers is that more access is always good for them, but I have seen sort of deeper reflection also from app developers and people working in that ecosystem, noting that actually getting user trust and getting a user to use your app is not a trivial task, and it's mostly not a technical task, but it's a building a business relationship. And here, this that aspect of additional sort of trustworthiness that you get from using the main iOS app store, from using the Play Store, that is not a trivial consideration. And even so, I can't judge this myself, but I've heard predictions that third-party app stores for iOS won't really catch on, because they will not have that feature that the users are already there, that the users trusted. So perhaps it's not going to be as much of a benefit for third-party developers as some may think.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, I mean, I have spoken to app developers and other app developer associations, and I think there's really kind of like a tiered response. There's a handful of very large app developers who think that these opportunities for link outs and to circumvent App Store protections are going to be good, because they, as Mikolaj kind of alluded to, have already built up this reputation and have won over consumer trust and can engage with those consumers directly, and thus kind of circumvent App Store rules and benefit from that circumvention. But then there's a whole bunch of app developers, many more in number, but smaller in size, who have benefited tremendously from the ecosystems of the gatekeepers, and who are concerned about what the downstream repercussions are going to be. They are not looking at taking advantage of these particular provisions. They want to continue working on a trusted ecosystem where users are happy to go and spend money and are willing to download apps without a pre-existing relationship with the developer. And these companies, these developers, many European developers, obviously well represented all around the world, but also the European ones, will say, well, we're worried about what this, taking this smaller group of developers who are doing a lot of business on the App Store and moving that business outside of the App Store. What will that do for future investment in the App Store? What will that do for the future investment in this ecosystem? What will that do for consumer trust in this ecosystem, which they will continue to rely on and won't really be able to benefit from some of these DMA provisions?
Yeah, I do agree, and I'd like to add a few statistics here coming from Google, according to which Google in 2024 alone blocked 2.4 million apps, banned more than 150,000 developer accounts, and stopped over 1 million apps from accessing excessive data, which is a privacy concern, obviously. And these actions, in a way, also reflect the scale of what is at risk, the scale of the cybersecurity threat when we use our handsets. Now, I still don't see any additional questions coming from our audience, so I would like to ask a final question to you, and this is it's related, but it's also a bit looking into the future. What could be the next big thing here, given that DMA enforcement is now targeting mobile system operators, primarily Apple, primarily Google. Now, where is this going to lead to? I can well imagine that we are going to have a similar debate about cloud computing, where it happens that the largest, a handful of very large US cloud services, cloud technology operators operate cloud marketplaces where policymakers could come to the conclusion that there's a lot of self-preferencing going on. Now, this is not necessarily covered by the Digital Market Act, but do you see any political appetite on the side of competition enforcement in the EU to also go after cloud services in the near to medium term future?
Is that to me?
Yeah, to all of you. You can come in first if you like. Yeah.
I'm happy to start. But first, I just wanted to go back and say one last thing on the other issue we just discussed. So I think this is important for all the reasons Kay and Nicholas just discussed about. In the United States, we have this case in Ohio v. Amex, which dealt with anti-steering rules. And the whole idea here is you have to look at the platform as a whole when you're going to be judging whether conduct is anti-competitive or not, right? Because the whole point is just because it benefits one side of the platform, in this case, developers, does not at all mean that it's going to be good for the platform as a whole. Platforms need to balance the concerns with both users and developers. And I think one of the problems with the DMA, of course, is it's just, it sort of assumes that what's good for developers is good for the platform always. And that's just not true for investment reasons, for consumer reasons, everything that Kay and others mentioned. That's point number one. With respect to AI, we've certainly heard rumblings about this, and I think this is certainly would be a concern. I think that the security concerns that could arise from having these sorts of provisions, which we've already discussed, have a lot of problems from that perspective being applied to cloud and AI. I think that would only exacerbate the security concerns. It's probably a whole other panel to discuss why. But I think what I would say is, whether the DMA sorts of rules should apply to AI and cloud in the first place, I think it really seems like they would be out of place. I think you've got a robust competition at the cloud level, both among American hyperscalers, but also, actually found a website, European Alternatives. They listed a number of European players, right, that are up and coming, right? Certainly not the market structure that I think we see in these other markets. And even at the foundation model level, I think there's even more competition. Again, not just with big tech firms, but non-big tech firms and European players, right? Very serious European players like Mistral AI and others. So again, it seems that the sort of competitive dynamics there don't justify ex-ante regulation. And another reason being, of course, that the DMA itself was premised, I think, on this idea that ex post competition law had failed, right? And we had tried all these investigations that didn't work. And of course, there's no such similar record with cloud and AI, right? This is still happening. There haven't been long, big investigations that we can say, oh, it's not working, so we should do ex-ante regulation. And then I would also note that the sorts of concerns that the DMA is focused on, that we've all been discussing, largely exclusionary conduct concerns, at least in the United States, the focus with cloud companies is on very different type of conduct, specifically these horizontal potential competition, partnerships, and acquisitions, right? So it's not even really the conduct that the DMA is focused on, that at least in America, people are really taking seriously. And I guess my last point would be is, getting into this idea of exemptions, right? I mean, should AI sort of be seen as exempt from the DMA? I think we should sort of, to tie these threads together, be talking about cybersecurity, broader cybersecurity exemptions for the DMA, for all the reasons we've gotten into. And I would just note that there's a good reason to think that this would be a good idea, again, from sort of the US transatlantic perspective, from some of the findings we had in the Apple v. Epic case. One of the things the court asked was, it said, could Apple, having got these pro-competitive security-based justifications, right, by doing other things, right, were there least restrictive alternatives to engage in this behavior? And the court found that there weren't, right? Epic couldn't show that, oh, Apple should have done this and they still could have got those benefits, but not harm consumers, right? So I think that has implications for DMA compliance. Yes, these companies are very smart and sophisticated and they can figure out other ways to do this, But we shouldn't pretend for a second that this is not going to come at the expense of security and privacy type concerns. And I would just note, finally, there's another approach out there. We look a lot at what's going on around the world, and the Japanese government, for example, and their mobile smartphone bill, right? It's very now in force. It's very much similar to the DMA ex-ante type regulation per se rules, but they specifically have very broad cybersecurity exemptions, right? That they have. So again, even if the DMA doesn't want to depart from sort of the per se approach and have robust pro-competitive justifications, they could still follow a model like Japan and have robust, broad exemptions for cybersecurity, and that would be, I think, an improvement on the status quo.
Okay. Okay, Nikolai, do you want to come in here? Okay.
Yeah, gladly. And I noticed that there is now a question in the chat. Just kind of following up on this, what Joseph just mentioned about the Japanese model. We've got a different kind of ex-ante tool type instrument in the UK. We've got a different one in Germany. There's lots of different approaches out there and lots of different ways that government policymakers can come and tackle this issue. And they don't have to follow sort of the one size fits all EU approach. We only kind of briefly touched on this EU approach of, well, taking Android's quite open ecosystem and imposing rules on it to try to, similar rules that they're imposing on the Apple ecosystem, but not taking into account that these are two very different ecosystems, and applying these kind of rules in one context is going to have different effects and different cybersecurity implications than in the other context. And that there are other ways of approaching these problems that take a more nuanced approach, that take a more tailored, calibrated approach to the different interventions, and can address other concerns around not just what is good for business users of the platforms, but also what are good for consumers, which we've talked about, cybersecurity, national security interests, and a whole host of other policy objectives that could also be taken into account when we're talking about making really big fundamental interventions into the way platforms are governed, and when they're being used by, in Europe, 500 million people, or if you take just the EU, less, but really major impacts that are going to be had from this, and that haven't been looked at carefully. So in many ways, I think the EU is a test case. Sad to say, not the best example necessarily in terms of a good practice, but certainly a lesson that other jurisdictions can learn from.
Yeah, and Nikolai, a final word by you, maybe?
Very briefly, looking at the Japanese example and some other sort of regulatory efforts around the world, I don't put too much trust in the wording of the provisions, especially in sort of legal cultures which different words may mean different things. But I think what's important is the practice of enforcement and the attitude with which the enforcer approaches those rules. And so my advice, and I've submitted comments to the Japanese Fair Trade Commission on this point, was that it is important not just to think of those security considerations as something in the interest of the sort of big companies, of the regulated companies, but something that genuinely should be taken on board and considered by the authority itself, and proactively so, and with proactive research into like what are the risks, and not just expecting the companies to defend themselves. Because I think the problem is, and we've noticed that consumer organizations, the privacy activists, they are not really participating in this process providing appropriate advice to the enforcers because of that weird situation that they don't want to be seen as in any way giving a hand, lending a hand to the big tech companies. So because of that, it is really on the authorities to take that into account robustly.
Thank you very much, Nikolai. That's been a good final remark. I'm afraid we need to come to a close here. We could have talked much longer. A lot has been said about discretionary enforcement, the unique case of DMA implementation and enforcement in the EU. So thank you everyone for your time, first of all, also for your engagement, especially to our speakers who've made time today to talk a bit about DMA enforcement and cybersecurity implications. I think we've heard, or what we've heard today confirms that competition policy making, especially when we are talking about ex-ante regulation, it rarely comes without trade-offs. And this is particularly true for the EU, I would say. Less so for the US case, probably, because it's much more centric around case-by-case investigation and analysis. And based on what you said, Joe, I think it is worthwhile for EU regulators, but also policymakers and lawmakers that may want to improve the regulation at some point, to look at the accumulated knowledge, accumulated through investigations, and the decisions that have been made by US courts, especially the case that you mentioned about Apple and Apple versus Epic. And I think that if enforcement in the EU ignores the realities of platform-specific architectures, and especially also user risks, which you repeatedly referred to, Kay and Mikolai, then it risks the very people the DMA meant to protect in the first place. To come to a close, I think that we at ECIPE, you and your organizations, we will continue to raise these issues. At ECIPE, we want to continue to raise these issues for rigorous but also evidence-based analysis. And we will continue to invite others to raise their voices in favor of or in opposition of certain EU policy initiatives to improve regulatory governance in the EU. So to come to a close, thank you once again. Thank you for contributing to this particular debate. Have a good morning, day, or evening, and see you next time. Thank you very much.